1945. War comes to Germany.
The
total war strikes back at the Germans in all its drama, to reach its climax on German soil.
100 days of death and terror.
There were moments, of course, before the Allies had crossed the Rhine. There were fears that the war could even go on into 1946.
The Allies conquer the Third Reich.
For many, these 100 days were simply a struggle for life or death.
Survival or destruction.
One can only imagine the horror of these final days. For Hitler, it was clear that he would kill himself. The only question was when.
Hitler's end in the bunker. The downfall.
The last 100 days were certainly the most terrible in the entire war for Germany and the German people.
The Germans capitulate unconditionally.
March 6th, 1945. Still 63 days before war's end.
In the morning, Cologne awakens to the certainty that this is the day the cathedral city will be occupied by American forces. Over the past few days, the 104th US Infantry Division had fought its way into the city center. The majority of the civilian population has been evacuated. Individual German soldiers surrender. It is unclear how many defenders have entrenched themselves in the city center. The Americans are faced with heavy losses in house-to-house combat. The Wehrmacht still holds large parts of the Reich, but the Allies are on the advance. In the east, the Red Army is at the River Oder. In the west, Cologne is the next target. Protected by their tanks, the GIs approach the old city. On 6th March, the New York Times warns of scenes like Stalingrad, lurking snipers and Wehrmacht units entrenched in alleyways. Wherever there is resistance, the way is cleared. At the cathedral, a German tank stands in the Americans' way.
Cologne is certainly symbolic of a turning point, getting so close to the Rhine. As one of Germany's major cities, the largest city in the West, Cologne is the symbol that ultimately the Allies cannot be stopped. Yes, if they cannot defend Cologne, what can be defended at all? It's all about propaganda, about symbols, about created images of war. And here, of course, the Allies can promote the conquest of Cologne as a huge victory in saying even Cologne has fallen.
In fact, there's very little gunfire. At 5 p.m. local time, the battle for Cologne is over. The high command of the Wehrmacht almost laconically reports, the ruins of Cologne were left to the enemy. As propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels indignantly writes in his journal, that Cologne capitulated in an hour is downright shameful. US paramedics attend to an injured woman who got caught between the lines. Others are less fortunate. Old men consisting of nothing but skin and bone, cripples with glass eyes and wooden legs. The US Secret Service describes Hitler's last stand in Cologne.
March 8th, 1945. Still 61 days before war's end.
Remagen, 50 kilometers south of Cologne, stand the remains of a railway bridge that once spanned the Rhine. The day before, the Americans took the Ludendorff Bridge. German explosives had only damaged but not demolished it, so the GIs were able to cross the Rhine for the first time. Within 24 hours, 8,000 US troops form a bridgehead on the right bank of the Rhine.
Hitler has great hopes of holding the Rhine line, which is once again a great symbol. The Rhine, Germany's great river of destiny, must be held. Yet it is a very real obstacle. It's not for nothing that the Allies prepare for the crossing most carefully, and they are fearful. Who knows if we will do it at all and at what cost? And all bridges are blown up except the railway bridge at Remagen.
March 8th. A US camera team is on site. Since missing the historic crossing of the Rhine, they simply reenact it for the domestic cinema audience. A milestone on the road to victory.
The effect was, funny enough, not so much in the West. The real effect was in the East, i.e. on Stalin, because what we see is the crossing taking place on the 7th, the capture of the bridge. The very next morning, Zhukov is ordered straight back to Moscow to start planning the Berlin operation. And this is absolutely key, because the moment Stalin realizes that the Americans are across the Rhine, they might advance very rapidly indeed. And for him, the vital thing is to take Berlin before the Americans.
As Marshal of the Soviet Union, Georgy Zhukov is largely responsible for the Red Army advance in the east. He is regarded as a capable commander. On this 8th March 1945, Stalin immediately demands plans for the Battle of Berlin. Thus, for Zhukov's troops, the conquest of the Reich capital is the major goal. A military convoy has meanwhile arrived in Remagen. As the Ludendorff Bridge is considered unstable, many GIs are to be brought to the other side of the Rhine as quickly as possible. In Berlin, the news from Remagen is received with dismay.
Hitler is enraged and reacts like he always does, immediately ordering those allegedly responsible to be shot. Hitler finds himself between a rock and a hard place, realizing that the war is lost, yet hoping he will somehow manage it in the end, hoping for a miracle. And Hitler oscillates back and forth. The news from Remagen is, of course, another blow to his hopes that he might, after all, somehow engender an end to the war.
According to the mood report of the Wehrmacht propaganda,
the fall of Remagen was much discussed and linked to sabotage. The opinion among the broader population was that it's like the First World War in reverse. The homeland was being held under harsh conditions, while the front line was weakening.
west of the Rhine, US troops encounter little resistance from the populace. In Mechenich, a small community in the Eifel region, people take note of the invasion. Even the German defenders are no longer prepared to sacrifice themselves for Führer, Volk, and fatherland. In some places, soldiers still determined to fight are berated as war prolongers.
No one knew what would happen when the occupying forces came, and the fear was accordingly great. What will they do with us now? How will they deal with us? Of course, there were also stories from already occupied regions, and the propaganda did the rest by exacerbating the whole thing. And that's why the liberators were not necessarily perceived as liberators. On the contrary, most people were very concerned.
The Nazi propaganda is now showing footage from Berlin, where people are erecting barricades.
The mood has hardly changed. It is impossible to assess the true situation, or that of the enemy, and how everything will turn out. It is hard to believe in a good end to the war. On the other hand, one could not completely give up hope. The best thing was not to think and speculate, but do one's duty and wait and see what happens.
Despite the constant fear of insidious bomb attacks, the German people continue to do their duty. Supplies are constantly rolling into the battle zones of the Eastern Front, where German troops are confronted by an enemy housed in their own towns and villages, and acting with a brutality unlike anything in the history of mankind.
A look at the propaganda of the times portrays the Soviets as beasts that would descend upon the German people, ensure everything was destroyed. And of course that was their greatest fear. Fear played a huge role, especially in the East, where there was massive resistance.
In the east, the Red Army stands along a broad front on the Oder, but near Görlitz, the small town of Lauban has been retaken by the Wehrmacht. 8th March 1945, 61 days before the surrender. Prominent visitors from Berlin come to the Oder. Joseph Goebbels wants to see the situation for himself. In his journal he writes, "The officers accompanying me report on the fighting morale of the enemy. It is not especially high. They always take the position that if you hit them hard, they'll soon have to run."
Battle continues on all fronts. Its symbol is German man, facing his enemies with a strength and determination unparalleled in history.
Bearing in mind what the Nazis did in the territories of the Soviet Union and Poland, the soldiers know that great punishment and retribution is coming. The Nazi regime is also operating with this fear, Goebbels especially. If you don't fight to the last man, your women will be raped and you will be massacred and sent to Siberia.
In these places retaken by German troops, every house is marked by the cruelties of the Bolshevik soldateska. The bestialities are too monstrous to show all that the camera captured. These are some of the victims of those accursed, murderous beasts. In insatiable greed, the Soviet soldateska swept and plundered their homes.
Fear of the Soviet invasion was great. For years, this was also fomented by the propaganda. In hopes of maintaining the will to fight, Nazi propaganda repeatedly stressed that when the Soviet army comes, it will be brutal. Also already anticipating the extent of sexual violence and repeatedly painting a scenario of horror.
Terror is still etched in the faces of these German women. They tell of the days of nameless horror, defenseless, and at the mercy of the brutish hordes.
One cannot speak of soldiers and officers in this sense, only of brutish hordes who raped all women from the age of 13 to 68.
And these German citizens here too, yes?
Oh yes, not even my 60-year-old mother was spared. She was also brutally raped.
For the first time, one can say that this kind of propaganda began to be contagious. For now, it's all or nothing. And it's paradoxical that only at the end of the war does the propaganda suddenly take effect. Everyone knows that we got ourselves into this mess. It's going wrong, and now we all have to go down with a sinking ship. And there's no choice but to defend ourselves.
The rare successes of the Wehrmacht are still exploited by the Nazi propaganda, as in Lauban. On the market square, Goebbels praises the troops who have recaptured the city. Among them is 16-year-old Willi Hubner. But joy at the counteroffensive will be short-lived.
We know from the soldiers he talked to in Lauban, off camera, that he said, "Well, men, the situation is clear. But you're an elite division, so you have to fight for the system to the bitter end." Hitler's ideology, Hitler's conviction to never stop, never surrender, to perish if necessary, he lived it.
In the afternoon of 8th March 1945, the propaganda minister stages his last grand performance in the theatre of the nearby city of Görlitz. Joseph Goebbels is in top form.
So wie der Führer die Krisen der Vergangenheit bewältigt hat, so wird diese bewältigen. Ist fest davon überzeugt. Na, vorgestern sagte er mir, ich glaube so fest daran, dass wir diese Krise bewältigen werden. Und ich glaube so fest daran, dass wenn wir unsere neuen Offensivearmeen hineinwerfen, dass wir den Feind schlagen und zurückjagen werden. Und ich glaube so fest, dass wir eines Tages den Sieg an unserer Fahnen heften werden, wie ich je in meinem Leben an etwas fest geglaubt habe.
Er hat eine Bühne.
He has a stage. They let him, and he uses it. He sees his role as Minister of Propaganda and just won't stop. Then I must call on the people to fight to their dying breath. And that's what he does. Here we see glorious, pure Goebbels in all his power and conviction, in his role as Minister of Propaganda. And he must have found it hugely satisfying to again have the opportunity to make such speeches.
Jene Divisionen, die jetzt schon zu kleinen Offensiven angetreten sind und in den nächsten Wochen und Monaten zu Großoffensiven antreten werden, werden in diesen Kampf hineingehen wie in einen Gottesdienst. Und wenn sie ihre Gewehre schultern und ihre Panzerfahrzeuge besteigen, dann haben sie nur ihre erschlagenen Kinder und geschändeten Frauen vor Augen und ein Schrei der Rache wird aus ihren Kehlen emporsteigen, vor dem der Feind erblassen wird. Unseren Führer Adolf Hitler, Sieg! Sieg! Sieg!
When footage from Görlitz and Lauban is shown in one of the last newsreels, however, the audience reaction is somewhat other than desired.
Certain movie theaters are now showing the newsreel of Reich Minister Dr. Goebbels speaking after the liberation of Lauban. His talk of the coming offensive, which is to liberate the occupied territories within days or weeks, is met with laughter and derision.
March 19th, 1945, still 50 days before war's end.
The bridge at Remagen has meanwhile collapsed as a result of repeated German air raids. A US pioneer unit had still vainly tried to salvage the unstable structure. Hitler's order to smash the American bridgehead on the right bank of the Rhine remains ineffective. Instead, American units are advancing to the south. In Rheinbrawl, a fanatical first lieutenant categorically refuses to capitulate and continues to offer resistance. At 3 o'clock on this March 19th, 1945, GIs invade the village. The villagers stayed in their cellars for days, waiting for the fighting to end. Any choosing to wave the white flag too soon was threatened with death by the soldiers. These Germans, too, face an uncertain future.
You lived for many years in a dictatorship, in a state that told you what to do and not to do, and suddenly everything's totally different and you're on your own. The state is no longer leading you by the hand, so to speak, in both a positive and negative sense. And for many that was a dead loss. Most people were not very enthusiastic. Perhaps they were just relieved that the war was over.
As a German soldier writes to his family,
This war will not foreseeably end with a truce, but only when the resistance of the last division in the last corner of the Reich is broken.
while US armies are advancing along the Rhine and south of the Eifel, British and Canadian troops have been through some heavy combat in the Reichswald. Now they are pushing forward on a broad front to the lower Rhine. This is where British Field Marshal Bernard L. Montgomery wants to cross the Rhine. His American partner, General George S. Patton, is opposed. For him, it is out of the question for the Americans to end up second in this decisive operation. He urges Eisenhower's chief strategist, Omar Bradley, to take action.
Patton was definitely unconventional. Not a military leader in the usual sense, well-behaved, always choosing the right words, but the exact opposite. He used very foul language. An eccentric who banged the table, who did unthinkable things, but he was a good soldier, someone who could lead his troops very competently.
Patton was brilliant in certain cases, but also could be disastrous in others. He was a mixture of foul-mouthed but God-fearing man. He was somebody who should perhaps never have been let out except in wartime. He was somebody who certainly the German generals feared more than any other Allied commander.
The eccentric star general has an aversion to long-planned offensives. One must adapt to the circumstances, Patton believes, and immediately take every opportunity to surprise the enemy. His soldiers both adore him and fear him.
Patton was also an absolute expert when it came to tank warfare and assured very rapid advances. And that's why he was always relied upon, no matter what he did. He even once praised the SS by saying, "Well, somehow they are very disciplined sons of bitches." I think that was the quote. They know how to fight. He got away with such things and was repeatedly deployed because he made sure that the Allies could quickly advance into German territory.
In only 8 days, US General George S. Patton drives the German Army Group G out of Saarland and the Palatinate and is advancing towards the Rhine. On this 19th March 1945, 50 days before the German surrender, US soldiers are close to Koblenz, Worms and Bad Dürkheim. "This is a big show," Patton writes in his journal. At 2:30 p.m., he gets permission to cross the Rhine. The Americans encounter little resistance. In many places, some people even welcome the enemy troops. German soldiers surrender by the thousands. Their commander-in-chief is beside himself.
Hitler assumes that if we lose the war, we must all at least perish. And he stages, so to speak, he choreographs the downfall in propaganda, in his orders, his radical orders, which do not hold back from destroying the livelihoods of the German people. He's not interested in stopping at any point and saying, well, somehow we'll come to an agreement. And this includes his so-called Nero Decree of March 19th, 1945, in which he orders that scorched earth should ultimately be carried out on German soil as well.
The so-called Führer's Decree states,
all military traffic, communications, industrial and supply facilities, as well as all material assets within the Reich which the enemy can somehow use to continue his fight, immediately or in the foreseeable future, are to be destroyed.
Hitler issued the so-called Nero Decree because he said, if we have to surrender territory now, we might as well leave the enemy devastated territory so that he can no longer use it. And that means that everything somehow useful must be flattened, destroyed. Had that really occurred, Germany would have been catapulted back into the Middle Ages, and the destruction would have been far greater than was actually the case.
The order is contested. Armaments Minister Albert Speer will later report that in a private conversation, Hitler explained that as a result of selection by the war, the German people consisted only of the mediocre, who had shown themselves to be inferior to the stronger people of the East.
At some point in the winter of 44-45, a change comes over Albert Speer, where he realizes we won't win the war anymore, so we might as well do a bit of preparation for the new times ahead. He travels to the front. He also talks to industrialists, and they all agree, which Speer concedes, that the Nero Decree will not be implemented in March 1945 as planned. Although some paralysis here and there is likely, some things will get blown up, there will be no scorched earth where everything gets blown to bits.
By the end of March, after 2 fierce arguments, Speer is able to convince the dictator to essentially mitigate his Nero Decree, and the Minister of Armaments pulls off an added coup when he is given sole responsibility for implementing the measures.
March 20th, 1945, still 49 days before war's end.
That afternoon, in the garden of the Berlin Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler makes his last appearance for the Nazi propaganda. The scenes are shown a few days later in the German weekly newsreel.
Hitler is rapidly deteriorating physically. Watching these final scenes of him awarding the Iron Cross to these very young soldiers, these Hitler youths, you don't think you're seeing a 56-year-old man, but someone very much older. Under the burden of war, certainly the psychological burden as well, Hitler's health is deteriorating. And here he is once again presenting the Junge Garde, or Young Guard, who fights for the regime, who is decorated. The Hitler youth, who then distinguish themselves in the battle for Silesia and elsewhere, on the Oder front and so on, in order to give fresh hope to a Junge Garde who fight in the People's Army and other units.
After the dictator has disappeared off stage, the youngsters are introduced.
As the Russians advanced closer to Lauban, I volunteered as a messenger for the combat commander of Lauban. My mission was to bring reports to the individual company command posts. Added to that, I often brought bazookas and rations to the main battle line. I brought the bazookas in hand carts or barrows into the HKL under enemy fire.
12-year-old Alfred Tschesch is hailed in the official Nazi newspaper Völkischer Beobachter as a role model for the battling youth in the struggle to be or not to be.
March 23rd, 1945, still 46 days before war's end.
Nierstein on the Rhine, from where the Americans are planning to cross the river at night. But on his own authority, General Patton has brought the operation forward by 24 hours. On the morning of March 23rd, 1945, everything is decided in Nierstein. Supplies roll through the city. Camera teams of the US Signal Corps record the world historical event, the largest amphibious landing operations since D-Day. Patton thus steals the show from his British allies, who are preparing to cross the river on the lower Rhine. The Allies stand in a broad front at the Rhine, while Montgomery and his armies are close to Wesel, still waiting for the order to attack. The Americans have formed a bridgehead at Nierstein. The few German defenders on the eastern bank of the Rhine surrender without resistance. On this, March 23rd, 1945, an excited Patton calls General Omar Bradley. "Brad, for God's sake, tell everybody we made it over. Tell the world that the Third Army did it before Monty even began the crossing." It's Patton's triumph, and he wants to celebrate it properly.
Patton would like to take every opportunity of demonstrating, shall we say, a fairly popular, often even vulgar, contempt for the enemy. He would certainly have done that if it was a question of the Soviets were on the other side, because he certainly hated the Soviets just as much as he hated the Nazis.
Farther south, the next day, in Oppenheim, Patton crosses the Rhine in a jeep. He stops in the middle of the pontoon bridge and pisses into Germany's iconic river. "I took a piss in the Rhine," he wrote succinctly in his notes. "I've waited a long time for this," he allegedly said later to American reporters. "I deliberately didn't piss this morning so that I had the full load."
March 25th, 1945, still 44 days before war's end.
The Royal Air Force bombs German positions and traffic routes on the lower Rhine in order to block the retreat into the Ruhr area.
The few who won the Battle of Britain have today become the many for the Battle of Germany.
Just 24 hours after the start of Operation Plunder, the British control a bridgehead about 10 kilometers wide on the other side of the Rhine. The British commanders had meticulously prepared the gigantic maneuver in the war room of the War Cabinet in London. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, however, is unaware that the Americans are thwarting his plans. He believes that the Allies, under British leadership, will conquer the Ruhr area from the Lower Rhine. The Prime Minister travels to the headquarters of Field Marshal Montgomery to attend the spectacle in person. Winston Churchill crosses the Rhine on this 25th of March, 1945. Although he now knows that Patton stole his thunder, he puts a good face on the matter.
Churchill wanted to be there, he wanted to be seen, but also it was a way of him demonstrating that Britain was a key player amongst the big three, and that he himself played a leading role. That's why he crossed the Rhine with Montgomery against the orders of Eisenhower. Eisenhower would not want to have exposed the British Prime Minister to any kind of danger.
With the Prime Minister making another crossing of the Rhine, the advancing armies roll on into the Reich with relentless speed. As Germany's doom approaches, the soldiers of the Allied armies pay tribute to Britain's man of destiny, whose courage and steadfastness in the dark years will be remembered in the hour of victory.
Churchill is said to have repeatedly shouted, "Now we have them! Now they're finished!" At the same time, US units are advancing on the right bank of the Rhine. To cover their retreat, the German defense has set fire to the fields and woods. But scorched earth cannot stop the superiority of the GIs. They have an easy time of it with the Germans. For the Americans, the battle is long over. Conscious of victory, they smirk. The British would have used cannons to crack a walnut. The advance on the Ruhr area offers the opportunity for more propaganda campaigns. For the camera, a US grenade is specially dedicated to the Cannon King of Essen, for Herr Krupp. Within a week, the Allies will have cut off all supply lines in the Ruhr area. 25th of March, 1945. The Nazi Gauleiter has bills posted in Essen.
We will crush the enemy again with brutal force. Women and children are no longer allowed in this combat zone. Food, housing, bread, milk, water, light, etc. will all be cut off. There will no longer be any means of survival. Total evacuation is therefore imperative.
The US Air Force clears the way for the advancing front. The GIs are to encounter as little resistance as possible as they advance, in order to keep losses to a minimum. The plan pays off. 25th March, 1945. 44 days before the end of the war. A 23-year-old woman in a small village in the Westerwald region writes in her diary,
Suddenly somebody shouts, "The Americans are coming." You can no longer think. You can only say with Schiller, "Everything is running, rescuing, taking flight." A sad picture unfolds before our eyes behind the village. Is this our proud German Wehrmacht?
Ever more German soldiers lay down their weapons. Many villages and towns are surrendered without a fight. General Patton writes to his wife, "It seems to me the war is over." In Cologne, a camera team from the US Air Force captures scenes of citizens who have returned to the cathedral city.
We're only allowed to show ourselves on the street during the day. No civilian may be seen on the street after 7 p.m. It's teeming with regulations and directives. This time we're to be thoroughly exorcised from militarism and National Socialism. Not one iota of what our world has been until now is permitted to stand.
April 1st, 1945, still 37 days before war's end.
The relationship between the British and the Americans remains tense. The Commander-in-Chief of the Allied forces, General Eisenhower, plans to direct the US Army primarily towards central and southern Germany. Montgomery is to advance with his troops towards Hamburg and Denmark. Winston Churchill is appalled.
Churchill wanted to advance as far to the east as possible to keep pressure on the Soviets. And when he found that, in fact, Eisenhower was in direct contact with the Russians without informing the British, and this was a famous and notorious communication which was sent at the end of March, basically outlining what his plan was going to be. And he told the Russians, even before he told the British, what he was planning to do. And this caused very serious concerns in British circles, not surprisingly.
Churchill does not think much of US Secret Service reports claiming that Hitler plans to continue the fight from an Alpine fortress. But Eisenhower has already notified Stalin by telegram that he has no interest in conquering Berlin.
Stalin replies, when he hears that Eisenhower is much more interested, he thinks that Berlin's got no further strategic value, and that Eisenhower is much more interested in meeting up to the middle of Germany and also to the south, where he thinks there is going to be an Alpenfestung. Stalin encourages this idea, and in his reply on the 1st of April, he says basically, oh, I'm only going to send reconnaissance forces against Berlin, and that won't take place until May, but it's quite right, we should meet up further to the south. It was the biggest April Fool in, I think, probably in history.
The British must yield. On April 1st, 1945, the War Cabinet approves Eisenhower's plan. As far as Churchill is concerned, the West is thereby leaving all of Central and Eastern Europe to Stalin. But from his point of view, there is actually one good thing about the decision.
It is clear to all that the conquest of Berlin would only come at great sacrifice. Neither the Americans nor ultimately the British want that. We want to crush Germany. We want to defeat Germany, and as soon as possible, with the fewest possible casualties. Then it might be more sensible to prevent a big final battle in the Alps, which would again claim more victims, but to quickly crush the retreating Germans rather than fight a battle in the ruins of Berlin, which makes no military sense anyway, and would only cost thousands more British and American lives.
To quote a situation report of April 1st, 1945 by the Allied High Command,
the enemy faces a situation in the West that is beyond his control. It is pointless to prolong operations. Hitler is defeated. However, like all other Napoleons, he will not leave without fighting to his last breath. It only remains to be seen how long this breath will last, or if the Germans are prepared to join in.
On this 1st April 1945, 37 days before the Germans surrender, the siege ring is closed. US troops have conquered Frankfurt am Main and are advancing towards the Harz Mountains and Thuringia. The Americans are concerned that German partisan units are forming behind the front. Hate is the prayer, revenge the war cry. With this slogan, the radio station Werwolf appeals to the German people on April 1st, 1945.
This is Werewolf Station speaking, the station of the German freedom movement in the enemy-occupied territories.
We werewolves will give everything for our people, and if we have nothing to give but our lives, then we will die for our people.
The Werwolves declare that enemy soldiers and German collaborators are to be hunted down everywhere in the occupied territories.
The idea was that this would be a guerrilla campaign fought behind the lines of the advancing enemies to disrupt supply lines, etc. As so often with the Germans in this period, they're very good on the symbols, and they even have a flag and a radio transmitter and so on. But the reality was actually quite different. I mean, there were about 200 Hitler Youth members who were trained up to become members of this organization, but nothing much really happens.
Werewolf is something to be feared, especially by the German population too, so they don't get the idea of hoisting the white flag. On the one hand, it was aimed at smaller actions of sabotage, but on the other, at propaganda success, like the murder of a mayor. Whoever has allied himself with the enemy must be killed. We've passed a fair judgment here, and that should, of course, act as a warning.
There is distrust, especially among the Americans. They are afraid of fanatical partisans among the friendly, waving Germans. So the propaganda catches on. But there are, in fact, only a few isolated werewolf campaigns. For example, one night, the mayor of a small town near Herford is shot dead on his own doorstep, although a party member, he had refused to blow up a power station and capitulated without a fight.
April 9th, 1945, still 29 days before war's end.
The Flossenbürg concentration camp in northern Bavaria. Here, in early April 1945, over 15,000 people are interned and used by the SS as slave labor. When the Americans liberate the camp at the end of April 1945, this footage is filmed. They find 1,500 survivors and many corpses. Disease, hunger, and exhaustion have caused the death toll to rise rapidly, but executions were also commonplace.
In the final days of the regime, they just want to kill all those still sitting in the dungeons of the regime. They are not to survive. We won't survive ourselves. According to their logic, Hitler and his entourage, everyone who believes in him will not survive. So the enemies of the German people should not survive either. And that's why the execution sites are active. The regime does its best to ensure that nobody survives.
US investigators discover that prominent Nazi opponents were executed in Flossenbürg on the 9th of April 1945 by personal order of Hitler. Among them, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the world-famous theologian, had been arrested by the Gestapo because of his contacts to the resistance.
Dietrich Bonhoeffer was really a man of God in the truest sense of the word, someone who lived for his faith and above all for his church, for the confessing church that opposed National Socialism. And his participation in the resistance was his downfall. For a long time, nothing could be proven against him, but after July 20th, they suddenly had something in hand, and so he was executed shortly before the end of the war.
For Bonhoeffer, death is only the end of his earthly existence. At dawn, on April 9, 1945, he goes to the gallows. An eyewitness later reports that never before had he seen a man go to his death so piously. The responsible SS officer sends an encrypted radio message to Gestapo headquarters in Berlin.
Mission accomplished as ordered. Confirmation not required.
The remains of Bonhoeffer are burned in the crematorium of Flossenbürg. His final resting place is to be found in the memorial's so-called Valley of Death. At the end, Hitler and the Nazi leadership fall into a veritable murderous frenzy. All those involved in the assassination attempt of July 20, 1944, and still languishing in the regime's prisons, are murdered. Those accused of high treason die on the gallows or under the guillotine.
There was also a certain symbolic effect in saying people who took part in the resistance will be executed before the end of the war, just to warn the population. Watch out, look what's happening to them. Even though our situation is very difficult, if you do the same, you will have a big problem.
In Berlin's Plötzensee prison alone, 57 people will be beheaded by mid-April. Hadamar, a small town on the southern edge of the Westerwald. On the Mönchsberg stands a psychiatric institution which is converted into an extermination factory by the Nazis. Hadamar has been occupied by the Americans since late March 1945. With horror, US investigators discover what happened here during the war. In the course of the euthanasia program, initially the disabled and mentally ill was systematically murdered in a gas chamber. Later, patients were killed with lethal injections or targeted malnutrition. In a neighboring village, a young woman is keeping a diary for her soldier boyfriend. On April 9th, she notes,
"A dreadful fact has now been proven. Today it was revealed that 26,000 people were killed in the insane asylum in Hadamar. Is this permissible in the eyes of God and the world? The blood of these poor, tormented souls screams to heaven for vengeance. And for this, you've all spent years out there on the front to fight and bleed for a delusion and for nothing. Poor betrayed youth."
On this 9th April 1945, 29 days before the end of the war, the Red Army reaches Vienna. In East Prussia, the battle for the capital of Königsberg has been raging for days. Here, since late January, about 130,000 Germans have been boxed in. Soviet cameramen shoot these spectacular scenes of street fighting in the town centre. The major attack is completely chaotic, and the Red Army suffers appalling losses. On this day, an article with the headline, "Enough is Enough," appears in the military newspaper Roter Stern. Intended to fuel hatred among the soldiers, it says that the Germans are man-eaters, and there is no Germany. There is only a huge gang of thugs that runs away whenever there is any talk of responsibility.
I don't think one must forget that the excesses committed by soldiers occur when there is no regulated handover, when there is no surrender. After surrender, there are generally few, if any, excesses at all, because a few hours, sometimes even a day or two have passed between the action of battle and the surrender. Then feelings have cooled down. But when fighting is ended by fierce resistance, which costs the attackers half their number, then the danger of looting, massacre and excess is extremely high, as the soldiers avenge their comrades and attack the enemy in the heat of battle.
On April 9th, 1945, faced with a hopeless situation, the commanding German general, Otto Lasch, decides to surrender the fortress Königsberg. Whereupon, Hitler has him sentenced to death. Königsberg becomes the Soviet Kaliningrad.
Königsberg is a case that proves the opposite of what is usually said about the Red Army. We know that the capture or surrender of the city was relatively civilized and carried out according to the rules of martial law. That seems quite astonishing at first. There is a capitulation and a regular capture of the German troops, who were then led away as prisoners of war.
92,000 German soldiers are heading for captivity. Immediately after the conquest, the civilian population is driven from the city. Since late January 1945, the Red Army has stood at the Oder, preparing its major attack. The Oderbruch wetland is one of the last obstacles on the way to Berlin. It is only 75 kilometers to the German capital. Soviet troops have been busy for months building makeshift bridges. Over a distance of 200 kilometers, a huge force is to cross the river. On the far side of the Oder are the headquarters of Field Marshal Georgy Zhukov, who is to lead the main strike against Berlin with his 11 armies of the First White Russian Front.
The real plan is for Zhukov to go straight for Berlin and surround it first, not to fight into the city. And the reason for that was to make sure that the Americans could not break through from the west. One reason, of course, was the obvious symbolic importance of Berlin, the whole idea that who controls Berlin controls Germany, and who controls Germany controls Central Europe. But the other one was the question of Berlin, the symbol, the lair of the fascist beast. The Soviets had the right to occupy Berlin because of what they had suffered.
63 kilometers outside the imperial capital, a German fighter division takes up position to repel the Red Army's imminent attack. A newsreel cameraman films the last Wehrmacht contingent. The defenders are still only dealing with Soviet reconnaissance planes. Surrender here is not an option.
What is the consequence when I, as a soldier, lie at the Oder front with the Red Army before me? 99% would probably know it's game over. We don't have a chance. But what are the consequences? Should I go home? My home is probably behind the Soviet front. What should I do? The field gendarmerie is behind me. Somehow I still want to defend Berlin, defend my home. I am fighting for Hitler, for Germany, however I construct it. If I stick with it, I will only stop when I go into captivity or when an officer says it's over.
Footage of slain Red Army soldiers is no longer shown in German cinemas. Outside Berlin, a soldier writes to his wife. Both are fanatical supporters of Hitler.
Dearest, we bore everything together. Together. And together we are grateful for every gift. Together, that's just it. What are we alone? What meaning does it all have? What we have become? Not you and I. We. That is the beautiful, the great, for which we choose to bear everything, should it only remain to us.
29 days still to go before the unconditional surrender.